7 British warships, the elite of the Royal Navy. Radar, sonar, thousands of tons of armored steel. Against them, a single tiny Italian torpedo boat called the Lupo, and its captain, who seemingly left his sense of fear on his bedside table at home. By every law of physics and warfare, this battle should have ended with the instantaneous evaporation of the Italian ship. The British poured so many shells into the water that they could have sunk a small island. But what happened next defies all logic. Today, we are breaking down the most brazen, luckiest, and most impossible naval battle of World War II. We will see how one ship forced an entire squadron to frantically fire upon itself. We'll learn why British radars went haywire. And most importantly, we will answer the question: was Captain Mimbelli a tactical genius or simply a madman with devilish luck? Fasten your seatbelts. The seas are about to get rough. To understand the scale of this madness, we first need to look at what this wolf was trying to protect. And believe me, the cargo was even stranger than the fight itself. To understand why Captain Mimbelli's actions are called insane, we must first look at what he was defending. In naval history, there is the concept of a convoy. Usually, this brings to mind images of massive Liberty ships loaded with tanks, moving in tight formation. But on that May night in the Aegean, the word convoy was a cruel joke. The German command was planning the invasion of Crete, Operation Mercury. It was the first major airborne operation in history, but things in the sky were going poorly. Paratroopers were taking catastrophic losses and desperately needed reinforcements from the sea. The problem was that Germany had almost no navy in the Mediterranean. So, they did something that can only be described as an act of desperation. They requisitioned Greek kayaks. These were small wooden schooners that local fishermen had used for centuries to catch sardines and sponges. Rotten planks, weak diesel engines, sails patched a dozen times over. Into these fragile vessels, designed for 5 fishermen and a haul of fish, the Germans crammed 2,300 mountain troopers. Imagine the scene. The elite of the German army, the Edelweiss. Men who had conquered Poland and France, trained to survive on glaciers and storm inaccessible peaks. Now, they sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark, in holds smelling of fish and fuel oil. Their weapons, rifles and machine guns, were useless against naval steel. Their alpine training did nothing for seasickness. Most were vomiting from the swell. This flotilla moved at a snail's pace, only 5 or 6 knots. That is, the speed of a brisk walk. They had to travel 100 miles through waters completely controlled by the British Royal Navy. The British called the Mediterranean Cunningham's Pond, after their admiral. They patrolled these waters with one goal: to sink anything moving under an Axis flag. For a cruiser, meeting such a fleet of wooden boats isn't even a fight. It's a shooting gallery. A main caliber shell doesn't even need to hit a keek directly. An explosion in the water nearby is enough for the shock wave to turn rotten wood into splinters and men into mincemeat. The soldiers in the boats knew this. They sat in total darkness, smoking forbidden, conversations in whispers. The only sound was the monotonous thumping of old engines and the lapping of waves. And here lies the central paradox of this night. The most powerful army in Europe, which had conquered a continent, entrusted the lives of 2,000 of its best soldiers to a handful of fishing boats. And guarding this floating graveyard was just one ship. Not a battleship, not a heavy cruiser, but a tiny Italian torpedo boat named Lupo, the Wolf. None of the soldiers in the boats knew that at that very moment, just a few miles to the east, the radars of a British task force were already locking onto them. Admiral Glennie's electronic eyes saw the target. To the British, these dots on the screen looked like easy prey, like a flock of sheep headed for the slaughter. But they didn't yet know that this flock had a shepherd, and he had very sharp teeth. To understand how the Wolf planned to fight Leviathans, we need to look at its blueprints, and what we find there is unlikely to inspire much optimism. Let's stop for a second and look at our protagonist. If you open the reference books of the era, you'll see the Lupo classified as a torpedo boat. But don't let that word fool you. In the hierarchy of sea predators, this isn't a shark. It's more like a barracuda. Fast, toothy, but very fragile. The Lupo belonged to the Spica class. These were elegant ships, the pride of Italian shipyards. Displacement? Only 640 tons. For comparison, a standard British destroyer was 2 to 3 times heavier, and a cruiser 10 times. Length? Just 80 meters. This is a very, very small ship for an open fight. Its main advantage was speed. In trials, the Lupo could reach 34 knots. That's nearly 63 kilometers per hour on the water. But that night, speed was its curse. It was forced to crawl alongside fishing boats at 5 knots, burning out the clutches and the nerves of the engineers. Armament? 3 100mm guns. They could scratch the paint on a battleship, or punch through a destroyer. But against a cruiser, it was like firing a pistol at a tank. The trump cards were the torpedoes. 2 mounts with 2 tubes each. 4 chances to kill a giant. If you miss, reloading in battle is impossible. You simply don't have the time. And of course, the armor. There effectively was none. The Spica hull was built for speed, not protection. Any shell hit larger than 4 inches meant a hole straight through, or the detonation of the magazines. The Lupo was a glass cannon. It could bite hard, but it couldn't take a hit. But this ship had a component not listed in the technical manuals. Its captain. Francesco Mimbelli. Mimbelli was an old-school aristocrat, a count, a graduate of the prestigious Naval Academy in Livorno, a man of impeccable posture and icy calm. His crew idolized him, not for loud speeches, but for his professionalism. He knew his ship down to the last bolt. He knew his radar was the eyes of his lookouts, and his sonar was his intuition. That night, Mimbelli stood on the bridge, staring into the inky darkness. He understood the odds perfectly. He knew he was the only barrier between 2,300 soldiers in wooden boats and the entire Royal Navy. He was tied to this slow convoy like a watchdog on a chain. He couldn't run. His officer's honor wouldn't allow it. All that was left was to wait. And the wait didn't last long. While Mimbelli listened to the roar of the waves, just a few miles away, on the bridge of the British flagship, officers were already drinking tea and preparing for a light hunt. Let's look at those who were coming to kill the wolf. While Captain Mimbelli peered into the darkness through binoculars, trying to distinguish the line between sky and water, a force was approaching that can only be described in one word: Leviathan. In Admiralty documents, it was called dryly and unemotionally Force D. But for any Axis sailor, meeting this group meant an almost guaranteed death sentence. Let's break down exactly who went on the hunt that night. And when I say hunt, I'm not exaggerating. The British weren't just patrolling, they were out to kill. Leading this steel pack was Rear Admiral Irvine Glennie, a man of the old guard, a pragmatist devoid of sentiment. Under his flag were 3 light cruisers, any of which could have single-handedly destroyed the entire Italian convoy in 10 minutes without breaking a sweat. First was the flagship, HMS Dido, a brand new ship launched only a year prior. It wasn't just a cruiser, it was a masterpiece of anti-aircraft defense repurposed into a seagoing killer. Its main feature was 10 133mm guns in 5 turrets. These guns could fire so fast that from the outside, it looked like the ship was vomiting a continuous wall of fire. The crew of the Dido called their ship the Scolding Lady, but that night, the lady was in a killing mood. Following were the veterans, the cruisers HMS Orion and the legendary HMS Ajax. If you've heard of the Battle of the River Plate and the hunt for the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, you know the Ajax. It was this ship that cornered the German raider in the South Atlantic. The crew of the Ajax consisted of men who had already looked death in the face and made it blink. For them, intercepting an Italian convoy was routine work, something like taking out the trash. But that wasn't all. Around the cruisers, like hounds, prowled 4 destroyers: Janus, Kimberly, Hasty, and Hereward. Each of these small ships was larger, heavier, and better armed than our hero, the Lupo. Each had 6 to 8 main battery guns against the Italians' 3. Each had a full complement of torpedoes. Each had a speed of 36 knots. However, the most terrifying weapon of Force D wasn't guns or torpedoes. It was something Captain Mimbelli didn't have at all. Eyes that could see through the night. Radar. In 1941, radar was a technology bordering on magic. While Italian lookouts strained their eyes trying to see silhouettes in the moonlight, operators in the booths of British cruisers saw everything on green oscilloscope screens. They saw the Lupo long before it could see them. They knew its course, its speed, and most terrifyingly, they knew it was alone. Imagine the contrast. On the bridge of the Lupo, tense silence, men peering into the blackness, relying on hearing and intuition. On the bridge of the Dido, officers calmly drinking tea, looking at a glowing dot slowly crawling into their sights. It wasn't fair. It was like a fight between a blind kitten and 3 armed muggers with night vision goggles. Let's turn to the mathematics of war for a second, so you understand the horror of the situation. If we take the broadside weight of the Lupo, the total weight of all shells it can fire at once from one side, we get a laughable figure. About 30 kilograms of explosives in steel. Now take Force D. 10 guns from Dido, 8 from Orion, 8 from Ajax, plus 16 guns from the destroyers. Their total broadside weight was measured in tons. Thousands of kilograms of death flying at the speed of sound every minute. The firepower ratio was roughly 40 to 1. In boxing, such weight classes simply don't exist. Admiral Glennie arranged his ships in a perfect attacking formation. They moved on a wide front, cutting off any path for retreat. Their plan was simple and brutal. Close to point-blank range, turn on the searchlights, and turn the sea into a slaughterhouse. They didn't expect resistance. They expected panic, screams, and burning wreckage. It was 23:30. British radars clearly showed a group of targets dead ahead. Operators reported multiple small-scale targets in one escort vessel. On the bridge of the Dido, someone might have smirked. 1 escort vessel against 7 of His Majesty's pennants? This was going to be quick. Glennie gave the order. The cruisers began rotating their main turrets. The mechanisms hummed quietly, barrels rising, searching for their invisible prey in the dark. Electrical circuits closed, signaling the searchlights. Gunners pressed their eyes to the sights. At that moment, the distance between David and the 7 Goliaths was closing by the second. The sea was calm, the moon hid behind the clouds, and in this deceptive silence, 7 British ships prepared to wipe the Lupo off the face of the earth with a single blow. But they made one critical mistake. They forgot that a cornered beast is the most dangerous kind. Light. Blinding white light tore through the night. And in that same second, Captain Mimbelli made a decision that made the British admirals choke on their tea. There are moments in history when time seems to freeze. Seconds stretch into hours. For the 2,300 German soldiers huddled in the holds of wooden boats, and for the crew of the tiny Lupo, that moment came exactly at 23:27. The sea was calm, the moon was hidden, and the world was plunged into absolute, inky darkness. In this darkness, it felt like you were alone in the entire universe. Only the splash of water and the low purr of the diesels could be heard. Italian lookouts rubbed their eyes until they hurt, trying to see anything on the horizon. But the human eye is imperfect. It doesn't see heat. It doesn't see radio waves. But the British saw everything. At 23:27, the darkness was torn apart. It wasn't like a sunrise. It was like an operating lamp being switched on right in front of your face. Dozens of powerful arc searchlights from the British cruisers simultaneously struck the Italian convoy with their beams. Imagine the terror. One moment you were in cozy darkness. Suddenly, blinding, eye-piercing white light. It carved every detail out of the night. Every plank on the deck. Every terrified soldier's face. Every rivet on the hull of the Lupo. The flotilla of fishing kikes was exposed like they were on a stage. In the beams of the searchlights, they looked pathetic, like toy boats in a bathtub surrounded by adults with hammers. The soldiers on the decks froze. At that moment, they realized they were seen, and that meant in a few seconds, they would die. The cruisers Dido, Orion, and Ajax were already laying their guns. The range was perfect. Missing such a huddled group of targets was impossible. On the bridge of the Lupo, Captain Francesco Mimbelli was also blinded. The light hit him directly in the eyes, reflecting off the instruments. But unlike the soldiers on the kikes, he didn't freeze. In his mind, the picture of the battle formed instantly. He realized three things. First, they were discovered by overwhelming forces. Second, the convoy was moving at 5 knots and couldn't escape. Third, if he didn't do something right now, in 1 minute, these 2,000 men would be nothing but wreckage and oil slicks on the water. Any captain in this situation has a standard instruction. Lay a smokescreen and retreat, covering the withdrawal with fire. It's logical. It's rational. It gives the ship a chance to survive. But Mimbelli realized that smoke wouldn't save slow boats from radar. The British would simply gun them down through the smoke using their instruments. And so Mimbelli made a decision that naval historians still call a mix of suicide and genius. He didn't retreat. He didn't hide. He grabbed the voice tube and shouted an order to the engine room that made the engineers' hair stand on end. Engage smoke generators. Full speed ahead. Helm straight for the enemy. Do you hear that order? Straight for the enemy. Mimbelli decided not to run from the British fleet. He decided to attack it. One 600-ton ship against a 30,000-ton armada. He was going to throw himself into the center of the British formation like a rabid dog into a pack of wolves. Why? Psychology. Mimbelli was counting on chaos. He knew the British saw multiple targets on radar. If he charged at full speed, 30 knots, and burst into their formation, mixed with them, and started spinning between their giant ships, the British radars would go crazy. They would stop distinguishing friend from foe. He wanted to turn a massacre into a brawl. The Lupo shuddered. Turbines howled as they gathered RPMs. Thick, acrid black smoke poured from the funnels, mixed with a chemical fog. The tiny torpedo boat, its bow lifting, surged forward toward the blinding searchlights. He was heading straight into the lion's mouth. The distance closed frighteningly fast. 5,000 meters, 4,000, 3,000. The British on the cruisers at first couldn't believe their eyes. A small dot had separated from the group and was hurtling toward them at high speed. Was it a torpedo attack? A kamikaze? While the British gunners recalibrated their sights from the slow boats to this nimble, mad target, the Lupo won precious seconds. He shielded the defenseless kayaks. Now, to kill the soldiers, the British had to kill him first. And they opened fire. The first broadside from a British cruiser sent geysers of water higher than the Lupo's masts. Shrapnel drummed against the deck like hail. But this was only the beginning. Mimbelli had entered the kill zone, a place from which few return. What happened in the next 10 minutes can hardly be called a naval battle in the classical sense. It wasn't like a chess game where admirals move pieces on a map. It was a stabbing in a phone booth. The Lupo was racing at 30 knots. The distance to the British squadron was closing not by minutes, but by seconds. 3,000 meters, 2,000 meters, 1,000 meters. For naval artillery, this is point-blank range. The British destroyers Janus, Hasty, Hereward, and Kimberley opened a hurricane of fire. The sea around the Lupo literally boiled. Water columns from shell splashes rose like a wall, obscuring the view. Shrapnel rained down on the Italian ship's deck like gravel on a tin roof. It felt as if the air was made of more lead and steel than oxygen. But Captain Mimbelli didn't turn away. He zigzagged his ship, changing course every few seconds to throw off the British gunners' aim. And it worked. Shells landed left, right, stern, and a head, but a direct hit that would rip the Lupo in half never came. And then, the Lupo did the impossible. He punched through the line of destroyers and found himself right under the noses of the heavyweights, the cruisers Dido and Orion. Imagine this scene. The massive cruiser Dido towering over the water like an apartment building, and the tiny, agile Lupo racing past it at a stone's throw. At that moment, panic erupted on the British ships. The gunners trained their massive main battery turrets on the Italian, but the barrels simply couldn't depress far enough. Every gun has a range of depression, a limit below which the barrel cannot go. These guns were built for shooting at 10 to 15 kilometers, not 100 meters. The Lupo had entered the dead zone. He was so close to the sides of the British cruisers that main caliber shells flew right over his masts without doing any harm. This was the holy grail of tactics that every torpedo boat commander dreams of, but few achieve. While the British giants helplessly slewed their turrets, trying to catch the swerving target, the Lupo bit back with everything he had. His 100mm guns fired at point-blank range. Of course, they couldn't penetrate the heavy armor of the cruisers, but they shredded the superstructures, knocked out antennas, and smashed searchlights. But they weren't the ones doing the real work. The true heroes of this brawl were the Italian machine gunners. The Lupo was equipped with twin 13mm machine guns and 20mm Breda autocannons, and they were working at full capacity. Tracers stitched the open bridges of the British ships, forcing officers and signalmen to hit the deck. They shattered the glass of the pilot houses, turning it into lethal shards. They snuffed out the searchlights one by one, bringing back the saving darkness. In this hell, Captain Mimbelli saw a chance for his main blow: torpedoes. He was in the perfect position. To his port side, the silhouette of a cruiser loomed. The distance, ridiculous. Missing was impossible. Mimbelli commanded, "Torpedoes! Fire!" 2 long cigars hissed out of the tubes and splashed into the black water. Seconds of waiting. The crew of the Lupo held their breath, expecting an explosion that would break the British cruiser. But no explosion followed. Perhaps the torpedoes passed under the keel. Perhaps the fuses didn't have time to arm at such a short distance. But the mere act of launching torpedoes caused chaos in the British line. Signalmen on the Dido and Orion screamed, "Torpedoes in the water! Hard to port!" The cruisers began maneuvering violently, breaking their perfect formation. The massive ships heeled over as they evaded the phantom threat. Their line fell apart. And in that exact moment, the Lupo, taking advantage of the confusion, slipped between the 2 British colossi. He found himself in the center of the enemy fleet, surrounded on all sides by steel and fire. It seemed like the end. But in fact, it was the beginning of his salvation. Merged with the British ships, the Lupo ceased to be a clear target. In the dark, in the smoke, amidst the flashes of gunfire, the British gunners lost track of who was who. Where was the Italian? Where was their sister destroyer? Radar showed a jumble of blips. Visual contact was lost due to the smokescreen. The Lupo continued to pour out generously. The British captains, their nerves at the breaking point, began seeing enemies everywhere. And then, what Mimbelli had calculated from the beginning happened, though he had hardly dared to hope. The roar of British guns changed tone. Shells stopped falling around the Lupo. The British had found a new target: each other. In military theory, there is the term fog of war. Usually it's a metaphor for the lack of information on a battlefield. But on the night of May 22nd, 1941, in the Aegean, this fog was very real. It was a thick, choking mixture of black smoke vomited by the Lupo, chemical mist from smoke generators, and gunpowder soot from thousands of shots. Visibility dropped to 0. The British searchlights, which a minute ago had illuminated targets so effectively, now played against their owners. Beams of light hit walls of smoke, creating a milky screen. The gunners on the cruisers Dido and Orion went blind. And here, Captain Mimbelli's brilliant calculation worked. He knew. The faster and more chaotically he moved within the enemy formation, the more panic he would sow. Imagine yourself as a gunner on a British destroyer. You look through the sights. Darkness and flashes of fire everywhere. Suddenly, in a gap in the smoke, the silhouette of a ship appears for a second. It has two funnels. It has a low profile. Is it the Italian? Or is it your twin, the destroyer Janus, moving on a parallel course? You have exactly half a second to make a decision. If you don't fire, the enemy will launch a torpedo at you. If you do fire, you might kill your friends. At 23:35, British nerves snapped. On the bridge of the flagship HMS Dido, someone screamed, "Enemy cruiser to starboard!" The main turret swung around and unleashed a broadside. Shells roared into the darkness. But there was no enemy cruiser there. It was a British destroyer desperately trying to dodge friendly fire. Chaos escalated exponentially. The Lupo zipped right in front of the HMS Orion. The British opened rapid fire with every barrel. Tracers flew so thick it felt like you could walk on them like a bridge. But the Lupo was too fast and too close. Most of the shells flew over him and slammed straight into the hull of a neighboring British ship. In the logs of the Royal Navy, this episode is described briefly, but behind the dry lines lies a nightmare. Observing multiple targets, engaging at will. At will. In a tight sea space filled with 7 of your own ships, the Lupo had become a phantom. He appeared from the smoke, gave a short burst from his machine guns at the bridge of the nearest Briton, making them veer away, and vanished again. He bit like a rabid wolf, driving a pack of hunters into a corner. The British radars, which had given them an absolute advantage at the start of the fight, were now useless. The screens were cluttered with noise from water splashes and smoke. Operators saw dozens of blips. It seemed as if they were being attacked by an entire flotilla of Italian torpedo boats. No one could believe that one single ship was causing all this hell. At one point, the cruiser Ajax, hero of the Battle of the River Plate, began maneuvering to avoid non-existent torpedoes. He crossed the path of the Orion. The two giants nearly collided, their sides passing within meters of each other. The airwaves were filled with nothing but swearing and shouting. Destroyer commanders demanded a ceasefire, claiming they were being hit by their own cruisers. Admiral Glennie tried to restore order, but his commands were drowned out by the roar of the cannonade. Mimbelli, standing on the bridge of the Lupo, saw shells intended for him tearing up the water around the British ships. He saw British tracers crossing an empty space where he no longer was. He was using their power against them. It was judo on the scale of a naval battle. But it couldn't last forever. No matter how fast the wolf was, the density of fire was too high. Stray shells began to find their mark. First, shrapnel shredded the funnels. Then, a medium-caliber shell punched through the hole above the waterline. Then another hit the superstructure. The Lupo shuddered from the impacts, but kept going. The most terrifying moment came just as the Lupo was exiting the circle. One of the British destroyers finally caught him in a searchlight beam and held him. The tiny Italian ship was lit up like a storefront. Dozens of barrels swung his way. It seemed he would be pulverized. Mimbelli realized this was the end. He ordered the helmsman hard to starboard to somehow throw off their aim. But salvation didn't come from a maneuver. It came from the British themselves. In that moment, another British ship, seeing the muzzle flashes of its own destroyer, mistook them for Italian fire and opened up on its comrade. The British destroyer was forced to douse its searchlight and retreat from its own friend's fire. Darkness closed back over the Lupo. He slipped out of the death circle, battered, smoking, with holes in his hull, but alive. Behind him, in the dark, 7 of the most powerful ships of the British fleet continued to fiercely battle phantoms, and each other, for several more minutes before realizing the enemy was gone. When the noise of battle faded astern, a silence fell. A terrifying silence. Mimbelli descended from the bridge to assess the damage, and what he saw made him cross himself. The silence after the battle was scarier than the roar of the guns. The ringing in the ears of the Lupo sailors was so loud they could barely hear orders. The adrenaline that had kept them moving like robots for 10 minutes began to recede, replaced by a dull, leaden exhaustion and fear. Captain Mimbelli, still gripping the bridge rails with white knuckles, looked around. In the dim moonlight that finally broke through the clouds, his ship looked not like a combat unit, but a floating pile of scrap metal. The deck was littered with thousands of spent shell casings. Shrapnel, pieces of rigging, and shattered searchlight glass were everywhere. The railings were twisted into knots by blast waves. Smoke still billowed from the punctured funnels, mixing with steam from ruptured lines. Membeli ordered a roll call and a damage report. The reports reaching the bridge sounded like a death sentence. 18 direct hits. Think about that number. 18 medium-caliber shells, 133 millimeters and 152 millimeters, had pierced the Lupo's hull. Usually, for a ship of just 600 tons, 2 or 3 such hits are enough to send it to the bottom. But the Lupo was still afloat. Here we face another paradox of this incredible night. The very weakness of the Lupo, the lack of armor, saved him. The British cruisers were firing armor-piercing shells designed to punch through the thick steel of other cruisers and explode inside. But the sides of the tiny Italian were so thin that the heavy British slugs punched through them like paper and exited the other side before the fuses could detonate. The ship had become a sieve. Holes in the hull allowed one to see the sea, but the Wolf's vital organs, his boilers and turbines, miraculously remained intact. Shells passed within centimeters of steam pipes. Shrapnel riddled the bulkheads, but missed the drive shafts. In the engine room, there was a localized hell. Water poured in through multiple holes below the waterline. Damage control teams worked waist-deep in freezing water mixed with fuel oil. In the dark, by the light of emergency lanterns, they hammered wooden plugs into holes and applied patches made of mattresses and planks, trying to stem the flow. Pumps wailed at their limits, pushing the water back into the sea. The chief engineer reported to the bridge. "Water is rising, but we're holding the level. Engines are running. We can make 15 knots. 15 knots. Half power." But it was enough to get away. But what about the convoy? What about the 2,000 soldiers Membeli had charged into the cauldron for? The picture was grim, but not catastrophic. Yes, several kayaks had been destroyed by the first British broadsides. The wooden schooners were blown to splinters, and hundreds of German troopers were in the water. But the majority of the flotilla, nearly 1,500 men, took advantage of the chaos created by the Lupo and scattered into the night. The British later wrote in their reports that they had completely destroyed the convoy. They were certain of it. They saw the explosions. They saw the wreckage. But they were wrong. Their radars, confused by the Lupo's maneuvers, had lost the small wooden targets. The British squadron, considering the job done, turned and headed south. Membeli had saved them. His suicidal attack had bought the precious minutes that allowed the lumbering boats to vanish into the dark. On board the Lupo itself, the price of heroism was high. 2 dead, dozens wounded. The deck was slick with blood. Medics were overwhelmed, treating the wounded in the corridors because the sickbay was flooded. But the spirit of the crew was incredible. Men who had looked death in the face 10 minutes ago were now crying and laughing. They knew they had drawn the luckiest ticket in the lottery of fate. The Lupo, slowly, limping on both sides, set a course for base. He moved with a list, leaving an oil trail behind him, like a wounded beast returning to its den to lick its wounds. When the mangled ship entered the harbor at dawn, those on shore couldn't believe their eyes. No one expected him back. By all calculations, he should have been at the bottom of the Aegean. The receiving officers looked at the holes in his hull and silently removed their caps. Captain Membeli was the last to step ashore. His uniform was soaked with gunpowder soot and salt water. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked first. But the story of this battle didn't end that morning. The most interesting part began later, when the admirals of both sides sat down to analyze what had happened, and the conclusions they reached changed naval tactics forever. When the smoke over the Aegean cleared, the first reports landed on the desks of the headquarters. If you compare them today, you wouldn't believe they described the same event. It is a classic example of how military myths are born. Admiral Glennie reported to Alexandria that his force had intercepted a large convoy and destroyed it completely. The British were sincerely convinced they had sunk dozens of vessels and thousands of soldiers. In their minds, it was a perfect operation: depart, detect, destroy, return. But as intelligence began gathering data, the picture changed. It turned out that out of more than 20 caiques, the British had sunk less than half. Yes, losses among the mountain troopers were heavy. About 300 men died that night. But 1,500 soldiers managed to reach the shore or were picked up by other vessels. The convoy wasn't destroyed. It was scattered, but the core force survived. And all of this was due to one single reason: 10 minutes of madness gifted to them by the Lupo. The British Admiralty launched an internal investigation. The main question was simple: how did 7 modern ships, equipped with the latest radar, allow one tiny torpedo boat to mock them for 10 minutes and escape unpunished? The answer was unpleasant for Royal Navy pride. First, the radar failed. In 1941, this device was temperamental. Operators on the cruisers saw blurry blobs on their screens, not sharp dots. When the Lupo closed in and set a smoke screen, the radars simply went blind from the interference. The electronic eye couldn't distinguish between a shell splash, a chemical smoke cloud, and a ship's hull. Second, psychology. The British were used to their absolute superiority. They expected the Italian convoy to scatter in panic at the sight of their lights. No one had written a script in the manuals for a scenario where an enemy, outgunned 40-1, charges in a head-on attack. Mimbelli used aggression as a shield. He made the British doubt. And at sea, a second of doubt is a miss. But the most shameful fact, which the British tried not to advertise, was the friendly fire. Later, during inspections of the cruisers and destroyers in the docks, damage was found that had been inflicted by British shells. In the chaos created by the Lupo, Force D began biting itself. It was a tactical failure disguised as a victory. And in Italy? For Mussolini and Italian propaganda, Mimbelli was a gift from heaven. Amidst general failures on the fronts, the story of the tiny wolf who drove off an entire British squadron single-handedly sounded like a legend. Francesco Mimbelli received Italy's highest military honor, the Gold Medal of Military Valor. His portraits were in every newspaper. But Mimbelli remained a professional. He didn't consider himself a hero. In his report, he detailed the mistakes, both his own and the enemy's. He knew he was just incredibly lucky. Lucky that the British shells didn't explode in his thin hull. Lucky that torpedoes didn't hit him in that brawl. This battle entered the textbooks as an example that there is no such thing as a guaranteed victory at sea. Displacement figures and gun calibers mean a lot, but they don't mean everything. There is still the factor of human will, audacity, and the ability to make an irrational decision in a rational situation. The fate of the Lupo after this battle was short but bright. He would be patched up, return to service, and continue escorting convoys in the most dangerous part of the Mediterranean, the route to North Africa. He was called the luckiest ship in the Regia Marina. But in a war of attrition, luck is an inexhaustible resource. 6 months later, in December 41, the Lupo would find himself in battle again. Once again, he would be defending a transport, and once again, he would face overwhelming forces. But this time, no miracle occurred. The ship was sunk by British destroyers. However, the memory of that mad night off Crete would remain forever. Today, when we look at the diagrams of that battle, they look like chaotic scribbles. But behind every line stands the decision of a man who refused to die by the rules. And in this lies the main lesson of the Lupo. The history of naval battles is usually written in dry numbers. We count tonnage, gun calibers, armor thickness, and knots of speed. In this mathematics of war, the tiny torpedo boat Lupo was assigned the place of a statistical error. A ship that should have vanished in the first broadside, becoming an anonymous mass grave at the bottom of the Aegean. But history is not just mathematics. It is also psychology. It is the will of one man who in a decisive second refused to follow the logic of defeat. Captain Francesco Mimbelli didn't just save 1,500 lives that night. He did something more. He proved that, even in the age of radar, ballistic computers, and overwhelming technical superiority, the decisive factor remains the spirit. It is often said that there is no room for chivalry in war. But look at the end of this story. After the war, Francesco Mimbelli continued his service and reached the rank of admiral. He became a legend not only in Italy, but also among his former enemies. British officers, the very ones who tried to destroy him in 1941, later received him with the highest honors. Because at sea, professionalism and bravery are valued higher than the flag under which you sail. If you ever find yourself in Italy, in the port of Livorno, you can see warships bearing the name Mimbelli. It is not just a tribute to the admiral. It is a reminder to every young cadet. The scale of your ship does not define the scale of your deed. The battle of the torpedo boat Lupo remains in the shadow of great carrier battles at Midway or battleship duels in the Atlantic. But for those who understand the essence of war at sea, this 10-minute clash in smoke and flame means much more. It is a story of how David didn't just defeat Goliath, but made him trip over his own sword. On that night, May 22nd, 1941, the sea was black, cold, and merciless. By all the laws of physics, the Lupo should have died. But he survived. He passed through the steel storm, received his 18 scars, and returned home. We often look for logic where there is none. We try to explain miracles with tactical diagrams and technical failures. But the truth is that on that night, the sea simply decided to stand on the side of the madmen. On the side of those who are ready to go to the end, even when there is no chance at all. When you next see a small, inconspicuous dot on a radar screen or in a history book, do not be in a hurry to write it off. Perhaps it is that very dot that in a moment will turn the entire page of history. Because in the end, steel does not win the battle. People win the battle. And Captain Mimbelli's wolf will forever remain in the fleet's memory as the ultimate proof. Fair winds and following seas, to those who remember that honor is worth more than life, and that even one man is an army if he knows what he is fighting for.